Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, we continued working on our world scene, and we added a new functionality to add interactive game objects to our scene. And so we added in custom signs that the player can interact with and read the signs in our game. If you missed the previous videos, there will be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There will also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. Alright, so now that we have the logic in place for allowing our player to interact with our signed game objects, what we're going to do next is we're going to work on displaying that text to our player in our game. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add a new UI component for displaying dialogue to the player. And so this is going to be similar to our component that we built in our battle scene. And then this one will be used for displaying text from game objects the player interacts with, text from NPCs when they talk to them, and any other informational text that we need to display to the player while they're playing the game. Alright, so to get started, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and jump over to our code, and we're going to go ahead and make a new class. So what we'll do is under our world folder, let's go ahead and make a new class. So go ahead and call this dialog UI.js. We'll go ahead and export class dialog UI. And then we'll go ahead and add in our constructor. And so we will expect our phaser scene. And then for our dialog component, we'll also want to know the width of how wide we want this component to be. And so what we're going to do is we're going to assign both of these to private properties in our class. So we'll have scene equal to scene. And we will have our width equal to the width that's provided. And so what we'll do is let's go ahead and add these properties to our class. So we'll have scene and we will have width. And then real quick, we'll just go ahead and add in our types. So we're going to have our phaser scene and then we'll have our width. And so what we're going to do for our UI component is we're going to reuse some of the logic that we did in our battle menu. So we create our rectangle for displaying our panel that we display to the player. And so for calculating some of our sizes, one of the things we're going to need is a padding. So how much space we want between our dialog component and the edge of our screen. So what we'll do is let's go ahead and add a new private property to track this. So we'll have padding. That'll also be a number. And then what we'll do is in our constructor, we're going to go ahead and assign that. So we'll have padding, and we're just going to assign this to 90 pixels. So we're not going to make this configurable for the time being. And then for calculating the width, what we actually want to do is we're going to take the width of our rectangle we want to display and then subtract our padding from both sides. And then that way it'll be centered in our screen. And so we're going to do this, our padding, and we'll times it by 2. Then we'll need to go ahead and keep track of the height of our panel. And so we're just going to make this 124. And so let's go ahead and add that in to our properties. All right, so the next thing we need to do is we actually need to go ahead and create our panel. And so what we'll do is we'll go ahead and make a container. So we'll go ahead and do this container will be equal to this scene.add.container. And so for our position, we're going to do 0, 0. And then we'll have no objects. And so let's go ahead and add in our container. And so we'll just copy this. And this will be a phaser gameObjects.container. And so for our container, when we create it in our scene, what we want to do is we'll position it as 0, 0 for the time being. And the reason for that is we want our dialog container to always be at the bottom of our screen. And so as you imagine, as our player is moving around, our coordinates for where we want this UI component to be displayed is going to update. It's going to be based on where our camera is currently at in our scene. And so what we're going to end up doing is we'll create our container and we'll position it and we'll hide it by default. And then once the player interacts with something, what we'll do is then we'll show our panel and we'll prevent the player from moving. Then that way the panel will always be at the bottom of our screen. So for the time being, we'll just go ahead and do 0, 0 for our X and Y positioning. And so with our container, we need to go ahead and add our game objects. So let's go ahead and add in a rectangle. So we'll just call this panel. And we'll do this scene.add. And what we'll do is let's jump over to our battle menu code. And let's go ahead and find where we add in our rectangle. And we're just going to go ahead and copy this code here. And then we don't have to type it all over. And so we'll do rectangle. And so for our arguments, what we'll want to do is provide our x and y position. And so this is going to be 0, 0. So we'll just have our rectangle be placed relative to our container. So we'll do 0, 0. And then we want to go ahead and do our width and our height. And so for that, we are going to use our width and our height of our class that we've created. And so we'll have this dot width, this dot height. And then for our color, we'll go ahead and use the same color as our battle menu. And then we'll go ahead and keep our, well, actually, we'll go ahead and change our opacity 0.9. So it's a little bit see-through. And then what we can do with our panel is we can go ahead and pass that in to our container. So then what we'll go ahead and do is let's go ahead and update our origin. So it's in the top left-hand corner. And then we're going to go ahead and give it a border, similar like we do into our battle menu. So we're going to go ahead and do our stroke style and our origin. So let's go ahead and replace that. And what we can then do is for our stroke style, we'll keep it at 8. And for our color, what we're going to do is we're going to do 0x905 AC2. And we will keep our opacity, our alpha at 1. All right, so we can start testing and actually see in our container. What we're going to do is we're going to add 2 methods. We'll add one for showing our modal and then one for hiding it. So let's go ahead and add a modal, and we'll do show dialog modal. And what we'll do is inside here, what we're going to want to do is we want to go ahead and update the position of our container. And then that way, our container will be positioned dynamically based on where our camera is currently showing our view in our world. And so to do this, we need to go ahead and get some properties from our camera and what's currently visible. And so to do that, we're going to do this. We're going to get our scene. We're going to go ahead and grab our cameras, our main camera, and then we're going to go ahead and grab what is called the world view. And what this does is this returns a rectangle. And this rectangle game object has a lot of the properties that we'll need for knowing what's visible in our current scene based on what's visible right now. And so this is going to have properties like our X and Y of where the top left rectangle is in our corner. It's going to have a bottom property to know what the Y value of the bottom is. It includes things like the left, the right, the top. And then that way we can quickly get the values we need without having to manually calculate them. And so because this returns an object, we only care about a few properties. What we're going to do is we're going to destructure it to grab the properties we want. So we're going to do X and we're going to do bottom. And so X will be our X value of where our camera is in the X value here for the left side. And then bottom is going to be the Y value for where the bottom bound of that rectangle is. And so with those values, we can go ahead and calculate our starting X and starting Y position of where we want our container to be positioned. And so for our starting X value, what we want to do is grab that X value and we want to add our padding to it. And then that way our container doesn't move right on the edge of our screen. There'll be some padding and it'll be over here a little bit. For our Y value, what we want to go ahead and do is grab our Y value. So we'll do our bottom. And we're going to go ahead and subtract our height for our class. And so what that'll do is that's going to bump our container up, and then that way the bottom be aligned with the bottom of our screen. However, we don't want it aligned right with it. We want a little bit of padding, and so we're going to take our padding that we set on our class, and we're going to divide it by 4. Then that way there's a little bit of a buffer and space between the bottom of our container and the bottom of our scene. And so once we have these values, we can go ahead and call the setPosition method on our container. And so we can go ahead and do start X and start Y. Then we want to go ahead and update our alpha. So we'll do set alpha. We'll set it to equal to 1. Then that way our container is visible. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a new property. And then that way we don't have to return our container directly. We can just reference this property to know if our dialog UI component is shown. And let's go ahead and set this to true when we show our dialog modal. And so what we want to do is let's go ahead and add that property real quick. And this is going to be a Boolean. And what we'll do is because this is a private property, let's go ahead and add a getter. And we'll do get is visible. And we're just going to return this is visible. And so this will also be a Boolean for our getter. Then that way in our scene, we can go ahead and reference this property to know if our dialog component is actually shown to the player. And then that way we can do things like block input for moving the character around, but then allow input for processing our messages. All right, so then we'll need to go ahead and do our hide dialog modal method. And so inside here, all we want to do is go ahead and update our alpha and set our visibility to false. So we're going to do set alpha to 0, and we'll say we're no longer visible. And then what we'll do is at the top of our constructor, we're going to go ahead and call our hide dialog modal right when we create an instance of it. And so then that way, when we position our initial dialog container, it won't be positioned somewhere in our game scene. And then that way, it's not going to look weird to a player when they're moving around and there's just this floating menu. Instead, we'll wait to show it until we're ready to show something. So now that we have our two methods, let's go ahead and create an instance of this in our world scene, and that way we can see what we've been making. So what we'll do is we'll add a new private property, and we're going to call this dialog UI. And for our type, this is going to be our dialog UI class that we created. And what we can do is in our constructor, not our constructor, in our create method, after we create our controls, let's go ahead and create our dialog UI, and we'll do this. Our dialog UI is going to equal a new dialog UI. We want to pass in this for our scene reference, and we'll do 1280 for our width. And then that way we'll say we're taking up the whole scene width, but then we know our padding is going to make our container a little bit smaller. All right, so now we've created our instance. What we want to do is we need to go ahead and show it once we have some type of interaction. All right, so to go ahead and show our dialog menu, what we're going to do is we're going to come to our update method where we call our handle player interaction method. And so in our handle player interaction method, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to add some logic to see if our dialog UI is currently visible. And if it is, then we would want to go ahead and direct our input to our component. Then that way we can process the text that's shown. And what we can do for the time being is we're just going to see that if there's an interaction, we're going to go ahead and show our dialog menu if it's not visible. And then that way we can just see it. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this if our dialog UI is visible. We're going to do this dialog UI, and we will call hide. And then we will go ahead and return for the time being. Otherwise, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're just going to go ahead and call dialog UI, and we'll call show dialog modal. So now what we should be able to do is back in our scene, if we press our space key, we should see that our new modal shows up in our world scene. So what we're going to do, just to make it a little bit easier to test, let's go ahead and go into our config, and let's go ahead and change our alpha to 0. And then that way we can see just our component with our world scene here. All right, so now we've validated that our component is shown on our screen where we want it to be. What we need to do now is add in our functionality for displaying text, so the message you want to display to the player. And so this is going to end up being our text from our sign object when we test. And what we'll also want to do is we'll want to add in our input cursor, so that way our player knows they need to interact with our modal. And so to go ahead and do this, let's go ahead and jump back over to our dialog UI. And so what we'll do is let's jump over to battle menu. And so what we're going to do is we're going to copy a few properties here. So we're going to copy our user input cursor and our phaser tween. And so we're going to come to our dialog UI. Let's go ahead and paste those. We're just going to go ahead and update our names. So we're going to have user input cursor. And then we will go ahead and have our user input cursor. And we'll just go ahead and remove phaser, and we'll just do tween. And then we want to go ahead and add a property for our text game object we need to show. So we'll do UI text, and we'll go ahead and copy this, and we'll change from image to text. And then we'll want to add in a property for knowing if we're currently playing our text animation for animating our text. So we're going to go ahead and copy this boolean here and paste that, and we'll do text animation playing. And then finally, we'll need a property for knowing which messages we want to show when we animate our text. This will do messages to show. And this is just going to be a string array. And then what we can do is down in our constructor, let's go ahead and add in some of our properties. We'll do this. Text animations playing. We'll start off with false, and then we'll do this, messages to show, and that's going to be equal to an empty array. And then what we need to go ahead and do is we need to create these game objects here. And so what we'll do is below our container, we'll go ahead and do this. We'll do our UI text, and we're going to set it equal to this, and we'll do our scene, add text. And so for our position, we'll do 18 and 12, and this is going to go into our container, so it's going to be positioned relatively. And for the time being, we're going to go ahead and do cannot read sign text, and then that way we have some type of placeholder so we can test. And we want to go ahead and add in our text styling. All right, and then so for our text style, what we'll do is let's jump over to our battle menu config, and let's go ahead and just copy this whole block of code. We'll come back to the top of our file, and what we'll do is we don't need to export this out, and we can just call this UI text style. We will use Kenny. For our color, we'll do black. We want 32 pixels. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and add word wrap. And for our word wrap, we'll have a width of, we'll just say 0. So then what we can do is down when we create our text game object, we will just go ahead and copy our UI text style. And then what we need to do is we actually need to update the word wrap width. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another object that we'll copy properties from, and inside this object we'll do word wrap, and then for that object we're going to go ahead and do width, and we're going to assign this to our width, and we'll subtract 18. And so what we're doing here is we're just making a clone of this object here, but we need to override this property here. And the reason for that is we're passing our width, so it's going to be dynamic. If we moved our 1280 to this class here, then we wouldn't have to copy this, but we do want our width to be dynamic. So this will allow us to override it with our new calculated width that's provided here. All right, and then so after we go ahead and create our text game object, what we want to go ahead and do is actually add that to our container. So we'll do this container, we'll do add, and we will do our UI text. So now with our text game object, what we want to go ahead and do, well, let's go ahead and fix some of our imports. We'll fix that, and we will fix that. And we're going to go ahead and just add in our phaser import. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is now that we have our text game object, we need to go ahead and create our cursor image and our tween. So what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and make a new private method, and so we'll come to the bottom of our class, and we are going to do create player input cursor. And what we're going to do is if we copy that, we come back to our battle menu, we should have the same method. And so what we'll do is we're just going to copy all of this code actually, and we'll come back to our class. And so we need to go ahead and update our name. So let's go ahead and grab our user input cursor. And then let's go ahead and grab a reference to our tween. So I'll go ahead and do our user input cursor tween, and we'll replace that and our pause method. Let's go ahead and add the import for our UI asset keys. And then we'll go ahead and update some of our properties. And so for our Y position, we're going to want to go ahead and calculate this based on the height of our container. And we will go ahead and subtract 24. And so we're going to go ahead and take our height of our class on our container, and we'll just subtract 24. Then that way it should be positioned towards the bottom. And then what we can do here is we will take our width, and we're going to go ahead and subtract 16. And that way it's near the right edge, and we'll have our Y value. And then what we're going to want to go ahead and do is we will set our angle so it's rotated. We're going to go ahead and update our scale actually so it's a little bit bigger. So we'll do 4.5 and 2. And we'll want to, we don't need to worry about our alpha because our container is going to be hidden. And we have our tween, and so let's go ahead, we'll do 0, 500, -1. All right, so from, this is going to be our y value. I set our y value and then our y value plus 6 for where we want to go to. And now we just need to update our target. All right. So if we come out to our constructor, what we'll do is after we add our UI text, let's go ahead and call our new method to create our game object. Oh, and we'll go ahead and fix our import. And then what we'll need to do is we actually need to add our new game object to our container. So after we pause our tween, let's go ahead and reference our container. We'll call add, and we're going to do this, our user input cursor game object. All right, so if we come back to our scene, if we go ahead and press the space bar, we should see right away our Dialog UI component has some text, and we have our tween here. So what we actually want to do is when we call our show dialog modal method, we want to go ahead and restart our tween. So before we call our alpha method, let's go ahead and do our user input cursor tween, and we're going to do restart to restart the animation. And then likewise, when we call hide, we can actually go ahead and pause our animation. And so we call our pause method. And now if we go ahead and hit the space key, nice. And so now our input cursor is actually animated with our text being shown. All right, with that actually brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to go ahead and continue working on our dialog component. And we're going to add in logic for us to actually display our text messages. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more Great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.